This might be one of the craziest phones I have ever used. The camera on this is on another level. There's a variable aperture. The zoom camera can focus from stupidly close. It can practically see in the dark, and the battery numbers makes the iPhone look malnourished. But when I tried using this as a normal phone, I discovered problems which made me realize maybe you shouldn't buy this one. So this is the Huawei's latest flagship, the Pura 90s Pro Max, a name that's never been heard before. A little backstory, so Huawei used to be one of the biggest phone brands in the world. If you remember the Huawei P30 Pro back in 2019, they were the king of innovation. They made Samsung look like a joke because the hardware was so damn impressive. But since then, Huawei got banned from the US and the restrictions cut Huawei from using Google services. They also couldn't use TSMC for chips, and TSMC manufactures chips for Apple, Qualcomm, and basically every modern flagship. Imagine not having access to the largest chip manufacturing company in the world. Huawei was supposed to be completely cooked. They had to design their own chips. It's like telling a child to hunt their own food. I actually thought they just completely disappeared. But maybe they haven't, because they just made this. So I wanted to find out what Huawei has managed to achieve by themselves, and how usable is this phone outside of China. And just before we do the unboxing, I want to show you something cool from our sponsor, TomTok. Whenever I go outside filming, I usually carry way too much tech, and this Aviator T33 somehow fits my Sony camera with this massive lens, while still leaving room for extra batteries, power banks, and cables in the other compartments, as well as an RFID blocking pocket for cards, wallets, and passports. And when I don't need my camera, I'll just grab the smaller version because I can still chuck in all my essentials for traveling or when I'm just testing a phone. It's lightweight, water resistant, and even the buckles and the zippers feel pretty solid. And if you need even more space, there's the Urban X T30, which can fit up to a 14-inch laptop. It's got a quick access pocket at the front, a side pocket for a water bottle, a hidden pocket at the back, and this chunky padded strap, which you can actually adjust for either shoulder, and you can swing it around to the front to access everything. It fits way more than it looks like it should, so if you want to check these out, I'm gonna leave some links down below. But anyway, let's unbox that phone. And would you look at that? The full fat version box with all the goodies inside. So first up, we get a phone which, damn, those are some huge cameras. I'll cover them a bit later in the video, but damn, are they massive. You get a plasticky case, and even that has got a massive camera bump. And what's that? An actual charger brick with 2 ports? I feel like I'm getting spoiled, and for a 100-watt brick, this thing is tiny. But what's not tiny is this massive camera bump, because design-wise, this kind of looks like the iPhone camera setup that took steroids. And with massive cameras come massive sensors, which is how I like my phones. Surprisingly, on the table, it doesn't really wobble as much as I thought, but from the side, it still looks like a GTA ramp. In fact, the bump is so huge that it barely fits on my wireless charger, and putting it like a millimeter too high tips the entire thing. Wow. The design kind of looks like they went to Google and typed fun gradients and printed the first option, which I quite like, considering that Samsung it's not very inspiring with its black and white colors. But turning this phone on is where Huawei began testing my patience, because it's not what's on the outside that counts, it's what's on the inside that you can see on the outside. That first of all, they still haven't figured out how to do an in-screen fingerprint scanner, so you're stuck with a side-mounted one, which is actually pretty decent, but it still feels so outdated. Immediately, they bombard you with a bunch of popular apps that they want you to install, and they've already selected them for you. How generous of them. So this runs on EMUI 16 in the global markets, which actually runs on Android, unlike the Chinese variants that run on Harmony OS, which has nothing to do with Android. And this new version is a big deal because previously it was based on Android 12, and now this runs on Android 16, which makes it feel like Huawei is actually on par with the other phones running Android for once. And immediately you notice how much bloatware this phone has. And yeah, these are just suggestions, they're not installed yet, but What's the difference? On top of that, it's recommending me even more apps at the bottom. I appreciate the recommendations, but no thank you. Swiping right, you get some Assistant Today thing, which has even more suggestions at the top. At this point, they're just being greedy. I then noticed the Huawei app gallery and I thought, okay, that makes sense. There's no Google Play Store, so that's the logical alternative. Even more recommended apps? I already told you, I'm not interested. I then got a widget suggestion. No thanks. Receive notifications? No. New version? Go away. Like, I know this is just the first time setting up the phone and a lot of these things can be turned off and disabled, but showing me so many suggestions and ads just cheapens the first experience or the first impressions. At this price, this is supposed to compete with Apple and Samsung, but it kind of feels like it's competing with Redmi phones. If you remember earlier, I said that this phone has no Google Play services, which means that you have to sideload your apps, and just to make it more simple, I downloaded the Gbox to help me run the Google services, where I then installed the Play Store alongside a bunch of other apps like Gmail, YouTube, and Maps, and it does run pretty well just like any other phone, but according to even the official FAQ, it says that Gbox might have issues such as lagging, power overconsumption, and high memory usage. So yes, you can bring back the Google services. Yes, you can use your own app stores, but if you don't want to mess around with like anything, it's not really reassuring that you have to use these workarounds that you can't completely rely on. For example, the Blackmagic camera app is not available on the Huawei store and it's not compatible on the Play Store, at which point the only option left is to sideload the app, which got me thinking, what else is going to be broken on this? But enough of the software and let's focus on some good stuff. So for one, this screen is amazing. It uses something called the Kunlun glass, which is created by Huawei themselves, and not only is it super bright, but it's also really anti-reflective, which I think that actually helps it look brighter outside. On paper, it actually kinda sucks. It only peaks at like 1700 nits, which in today's standards, that sounds meh at best. But I don't know what it is, but it literally looks like a torch. In fact, in low light scenarios, the screen is so bright that it's literally enough to be used as a flashlight. It has an IP69 rating, which means that it's designed to survive high pressure and high temperature water jets. That's crazy. The 100 watt wire charging and the 80 watt wireless charging sounds insane. Like, what other phone charges wirelessly that quickly? However, when I tested the charging myself, I got some weird results. I plugged the phone in when it was at 18%, and when I came back after 10 minutes, I was thinking it would be on like 60% or something, but it was on 39%. And I know a phone is not supposed to pull 100 watts consistently, but my power bank was saying 17 watts, and at one point it jumped to 36 watts, which that sounds more believable. But that's barely any quicker than my iPhone 17 Pro, which kind of lines up with the GSM Arena findings. Not only is that sad, but it also kind of feels misleading. It doesn't actually feel like you're getting 100 watts. And I used the original cable and the charger, so what? Is my house incompatible? But now let's get to the reason why I think this phone is so special. It's the cameras. And for me, there are 3 key selling points of this camera that I think other companies should copy. And no, I don't mean the name. Get your own name. This main camera sensor, not only is it pretty big for today's standards, but it's also got a variable aperture that physically opens up to let in more light. And just to show you, look what happens if I try to focus on this thing at f1.4. Everything is completely out of focus, but if you switch to f4, suddenly more of the subject is in focus. And doing this in reverse, if I get just enough focus in f4 and then open up the aperture to f1.4, the depth of field becomes so shallow that it struggles to focus. So instead of having a middle ground, Huawei is basically giving you the option: let in as much light as possible in low light scenarios, or have the best focus possible in the daytime when there's plenty of light anyway. The second key selling point is that absurdly large 200 megapixel 4x telephoto camera. Not only does it completely embarrass the iPhone in terms of size, which you can immediately tell as soon as you start zooming into things, and the background blur becomes insane, but also this zoom camera can focus from 15 centimeters, which means that this can easily be used to take telephoto macro shots. This is like easily the most annoying thing about my iPhone, the fact that the tele lens needs like 90 centimeters to focus, so half the time it doesn't even switch, it just stays on the main lens. And just to prove how impressive Huawei is, look at this shot of my watch. How crazy is that? It makes a telephoto actually useful instead of just zooming into planes, which is exactly what I did, and I wasn't disappointed. The Vivo X300 Ultra can also focus that close, and there are other Chinese phones with massive camera sensors, but it seems like no one is talking about Huawei. It feels like they're secretly making this insane camera hardware that just happens to rival the best. And yeah, like in terms of normal photos, they're good. Apart from some AI upscaling, which it was pretty visible in selfies, especially in the hair. And speaking of selfies, the video is also surprisingly very good. But what's not good is when I tried petting this dog and I got left on red by a dog. That's minus 200 aura. And when I got home, I discovered the third key selling point, which is that the main sensor uses low-fick technology, which essentially is like HDR but on a single frame. So the dynamic range is supposed to be a lot better, and we've already seen this on the Xiaomi 17 Ultra, but for some reason it just didn't really work for me, and I don't know what I did wrong, it just didn't look good. But the thing is, at the time when I was testing this Huawei phone, I didn't know about this low-fick technology at the time, so when I was pointing this at my lamp, compared to my iPhone, I was thinking, why the hell is the dynamic range so good? I did the same test in bed, and I was pretty shocked with the dynamic range. Like, look at the iPhone's clip. The monitors are like blown out, but they're completely fine on the Huawei. And on a side note, look how freaking bright the Huawei shot is here. This was nearly pitch black and the camera was seeing more than my own eyeballs. To be fair, there is a lot of artifacting in low light, but despite that, it's still really impressive. And as impressive as this whole camera setup is, I do have to mention a huge problem that, for me, kind of ruins this phone. So you know how I mentioned that Huawei had to manufacture their own chips since the ban? Well, performance-wise, they are really far behind. So this uses the Kirin 9030S, a 5nm chip, which on Geekbench is around a third of the performance of the current flagships, or roughly the same performance as the Poco F5, a mid-range phone from 3 years ago. I understand that the Tensor chips inside Pixels have some crappy raw performance and people still buy them, but this is even slower than the Pixels. It doesn't mean that this phone is slow or it lags, but imagine paying flagship prices to get barely mid-range levels of performance. This creates a weird situation where everything about this phone feels extremely well developed, like the camera hardware or even the screen quality, but then in other parts like processing and the actual raw power, it's multiple years behind. So to answer the question, yes, this phone is still completely usable outside of China, but technically usable shouldn't be a standard when you're paying a huge amount of money for a flagship. And even if you could look past the side loading and the crappy performance, why would you want to import this? As impressive as the camera is, it's not massively winning in anything compared to the other Ultra phones. In fact, it's just about competing, so what's the reason to pick this and not a Xiaomi or an Oppo? Especially because you still might run into app compatibilities and the setup process forces ads down your throat, and the fingerprint scanner still feels a little bit outdated. To me, this still feels like Huawei is trying to get somewhere. It doesn't feel finished because it's so far behind in some aspects. It's still impressive how far they've come without TSMC or loads of other technologies that basically every other flagship depends on, which makes me wonder, if they did have all the technology they could possibly use, how incredibly ridiculous could this phone have been? But as it is right now, it is one of the most impressive phones that I probably wouldn't recommend, at least in the UK. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, go make your bed, go wash your dishes, and I'll see you next time.